People will tell you that silence is a passive thing, something that just happens between two people who've run out of reasons to talk. It isn't. I chose mine, deliberately, for 6 years, 4 months, and change, and I want to be exact about that number because precision is the least I owe this story. Last Tuesday, sitting in a hospital cafeteria in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I found out my mother had been quietly paying $410 a month toward my mortgage the entire time I refused to speak to her. I froze my own mother out of my life for 6 years over money I decided she'd cost me, and it turns out she spent that same 6 years secretly making sure I never lost my house. That's the wrong I did. I'm not going to spend the next hour explaining it away. My name is Claire Denning. I'm 36 years old, I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm a senior financial advisor at a boutique wealth management firm called Halbrook Marsh, where I manage close to $90 million in client assets and where 3 years ago, I made partner faster than almost anyone in the firm's 22-year history. I'm telling you my credentials up front, plainly, almost like a resume. Because you need to understand something before this story gets harder to hear. I am not someone who makes mistakes with other people's money by accident. I am someone who is very good at exactly the kind of decision that ruined my mother's retirement, which is a different thing entirely, and a worse one. I want to say a little more about what that job actually looks like day to day, because it matters for understanding how easily what happened next could happen. At all. Being a financial advisor at a firm like Halbrook Marsh means clients trust you with decisions most of them don't have the technical background to fully evaluate on their own. That trust is the entire product, more than the returns themselves. And the firm trains you, explicitly, to speak in language that sounds like certainty even when the underlying reality is closer to an educated bet. I was good at that language. I'd built a reputation by year 4 for being someone clients could hand their fear to and get back something calmer in return. I want you to hold on to that reputation for a minute because it's the exact same skill I used on my own mother in her own kitchen, and it worked on her more completely than it ever worked on a stranger. Because she had no reason on earth to think her own daughter would use it on her. Let me back up though, because you need to understand how we got here, and this didn't start with a bad investment. It started in a small ranch house in Tulsa, with a woman who spent 31 years as a hospice nurse, and one daughter who spent most of her adult life deciding that woman was the problem. My mother, Patricia Denning, everyone calls her Pat, worked hospice care at St. Francis for 31 years. The kind of job most people can't do for 3 months, let alone 3 decades, sitting with strangers through the worst nights of their lives, and then going home and making dinner like it was an ordinary Tuesday. She has a habit I didn't think about for years, and think about constantly now. Every single night before bed, she writes the next day's date at the top of a small spiral notebook she's kept on her nightstand since before I was born, and under it, one line, just one, about something good that happened that day, even on the worst days. Especially on the worst days. She started it, she told me once, during a stretch in the late 80s when she lost 4 patients in 9 days and needed a reason to believe tomorrow was worth getting up for. My father left when I was 9, and my mother raised my brother James and me alone on a nurse's salary in a house on Independence Street that she still lives in, still owns outright. Paid off the year I turned 28, a fact she mentioned to me exactly once, at dinner, not as a boast, just as something true she wanted to say out loud. The habit of hers that mattered most to me growing up, the one I didn't have language for until much later, was what she did with the grocery money. Money was tight, always. In ways I understood as a kid, mostly through small denials, no name brand cereal, no new backpack, unless the old one had a hole in it, but every single week, without fail, My mother set aside $11 in a jar on top of the refrigerator that she called, only half jokingly, the emergency fund. If James or I ever needed something small and unplanned, a field trip fee, a birthday present for a friend, movie money, that jar covered it without a lecture, without a negotiation, without ever once making us feel like the money had cost her anything, even though, I know now, it cost her plenty. She protected us from ever feeling the weight of her own sacrifice, and I mistook that protection. For years, for money simply existing. My brother James stayed in Tulsa, married a woman named Priya from his nursing school cohort. He followed our mother into hospice work, which our mother never once pointed out as significant even though it obviously moved her, and settled into a life 11 minutes from Independence Street, close enough to fix her garbage disposal on a Saturday. Close enough to notice things. I left for college in Colorado and never really came back, not in any way that counted. I built a career, an apartment, later a house, an entire adult identity 2 states away from the house where I grew up, and over the years I watched James become, without either of us naming it out loud, the reliable one, the one who showed up, while I became the one who called on holidays and sent gifts that arrived a few days late. James never weaponized that difference against me directly, not the way some siblings would, but he didn't need to. Every time our mother mentioned, gently, that James had stopped by to fix her porch step or repainted her fence, the comparison did its own quiet work on me. And I responded to that quiet work not by trying harder, but by deciding, somewhere underneath conscious thought, that the distance between us was simply who I was, a fact about my personality rather than a series of choices I kept making. Money moved through our house in visible, specific ways that I only understood as deprivation as a kid and understand now as a kind of quiet triage. My mother worked a rotating shift schedule that meant she was sometimes gone 3 nights running, and on those nights it was James, 4 years older, who made sure I ate dinner and got to school on time. A responsibility our mother apologized for constantly, and that James never once complained about, at least, not to me. I remember one winter, I must have been 11, when the furnace went out in February and the repair estimate came back at $400, a number my mother didn't have sitting around. She picked up 2 extra weekend shifts that month, wore her coat inside for 11 days while she saved toward it, and never once mentioned to either of us that we were cold because of a choice she was making rather than a situation simply happening to us. James noticed. He started wearing his coat inside too, without being asked. A small solidarity I didn't understand until years later when he explained it to me almost offhand, the way you mentioned something you assumed everyone already knew. That instinct of his, to notice what our mother was absorbing quietly and step in without being asked, became, over the years, the defining difference between us, though neither of us would have described it that way at the time. James stayed in Tulsa in part, he told me once, because leaving felt like handing our mother back the exact isolation she'd worked so hard to shield us from as kids, and he wasn't willing to be the reason she ate dinner alone most nights, the way she'd once eaten it alone, so we wouldn't have to. I left for exactly the opposite reason. Or told myself I did, that staying too close to a house built on quiet sacrifice would keep me small in some way I couldn't name, that distance was the price of becoming someone rather than staying someone's child indefinitely. I still believe there was something true buried in that instinct. I no longer believe it required 6 years of silence to honor it. I remember one specific afternoon, the summer I was 15, when James, already talking about nursing school even then, asked our mother at dinner why she never dated after our father left. And she said, without any self-pity in it, raising the 2 of you full-time on one income doesn't leave a lot of room for someone else's needs too. Maybe, someday. Someday never really arrived. Not because no one asked. A man named Frank from her church asked, more than once over the years, but because she'd built her whole adult identity around the two of us in a way that made room for very little else, and I understood only much later that this wasn't a burden she resented so much as a structure she'd chosen and never regretted out loud, even when she probably had reason to. I need to tell you about one more thing, because it's the detail I've thought about more than any other since last Tuesday. For as long as I can remember, my mother has kept a framed photograph on her nightstand, not of a wedding, not of my father, but of the day I passed my Series 7 exam, the licensing test that let me start working as a financial advisor. I'd texted her the results from a parking lot, half annoyed she hadn't asked sooner, and she'd printed the text message itself, the actual screenshot, and put it in a $5 frame from a craft store because she didn't have a photograph of the moment and wanted something anyway. She kept that framed text message by her bed for 11 years. I only ever saw it once, and I didn't think about it again until a hospital chaplain handed me a bag of her personal effects last week, and it was in there, wrapped in a washcloth so the glass wouldn't break. The wrongdoing itself started with good intentions, which is the part I have to be honest about, even though it makes the rest of it harder to understand. In my 4th year at Halbrook Marsh, my mentor and direct supervisor, a managing partner named Roger Kessler, was building a private investment vehicle called Meridian Growth Fund, a higher risk, higher fee product aimed at what the firm internally called sophisticated retail clients. People without institutional level assets who wanted exposure to the kind of returns usually reserved for larger accounts. I believed in it. I want to be clear about that. Because it matters for what comes after, I genuinely believed Meridian was a good product, and I put $14,000 of my own money into it the same month I pitched it to my mother. Before I ever brought up Meridian, I want to describe the version of that visit I let myself believe was purely generous. Because the self-deception is part of the wrong. I'd brought her flowers from the airport, a bad habit of mine. Cheap grocery store bouquets meant to announce good intentions without costing much thought, and I'd made a whole production of the visit being just to see her, even though I'd booked the flight the same week Roger first pitched Meridian to the advisory team. And even though the return ticket was for the next morning, she noticed the short trip and didn't say anything about it, just made a pot roast because she remembered it was still my favorite, and it was over that pot roast, not before it, that I brought out the printed fund summary I'd prepared on Halbrook Marsh letterhead like it was a formal presentation instead of a conversation with my own mother. I flew to Tulsa in March of that year specifically to have the conversation. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table she's had since I was in middle school, and told her that a fund my firm managed was projecting returns of 11 to 14% annually, dramatically better than the 2% her CD at the credit union was earning, and that moving a portion of her retirement savings into it would meaningfully improve her financial security in the years she had left before she planned to fully retire. She had $85,000 in a rollover IRA, essentially her entire retirement, 31 years of a nurse's salary, compounded slowly and carefully. She asked me, directly, "Is this safe, Claire? I don't have room to lose this and start over." I told her it was appropriate for her risk tolerance and time horizon. I used those exact words, appropriate for her risk tolerance and time horizon, phrases I'd use with any client, phrases that sounded like due diligence and were actually a script. She trusted me because I was her daughter, and because I had a license on the wall that said I knew what I was talking about, and both of those things were true. And I used both of them. The conversation itself, once it started, ran longer than I've let myself remember accurately over the years, and I want to reconstruct it honestly instead of compressing it into the single exchange I usually tell myself happened. She asked me first, before I'd even finished explaining the fund structure, whether this was something people at your level of the company do for their own families a lot, or whether this is a special thing you're doing just for me. I told her it was special, which was true in the sense that most advisors at Halbrook Marsh didn't personally sponsor a parent's account. And false in the sense that I made it sound like a favor rather than what it actually was, a convenient source of assets under management that helped my own performance numbers that quarter. She asked about fees. I told her the expense ratio was in line with comparable funds, a phrase that was accurate and also completely unhelpful since Meridian's fees ran nearly double a standard index fund's. A fact I didn't volunteer and she had no independent way of knowing to ask about. She asked, finally, the question I still hear most clearly of all of them, if this were your money, Claire, all of it, not just some of it, would you do exactly this? I told her yes. I had $14,000 in the fund at the time. She had $85,000, which was almost the entirety of what she had. There was an off-ramp, and I took the wrong side of it deliberately. Roger Kessler flagged, in an internal risk memo dated the same week I met with my mother, that Meridian Growth Fund should be limited to no more than 15% of any client's liquid retirement assets given its volatility profile. A recommendation that would have meant moving 12 or 13,000 of my mother's dollars into the fund, not 85,000. I read that memo. I have a printed copy of it in a drawer in my home office to this day. I moved all 85,000 anyway and documented her risk tolerance on the internal paperwork as aggressive growth, high time horizon, a characterization of a 60-year-old hospice nurse 2 years from retirement that I knew, even as I typed it, was not an honest description of her actual circumstances. Roger never checked my individual client files line by line. That wasn't how oversight worked at our size of firm, and I understood that gap in oversight as an opportunity rather than a risk. Which tells you something about who I'd become by then that I'm not proud to say out loud. There was a second moment, months later, that I've turned over more than almost any other. Because unlike the first off-ramp, this one came with a witness. Roger stopped by my office in July, after the fund's first quarterly report showed early softness, and asked, casually, leaning in my doorway with a coffee in hand, "Your mom's the one in the Meridian Fund, right? How big a piece did she end up taking?" When I told him 85,000, his whole posture changed. He said, "Claire, that's not what we talked about in the risk memo. I want you to trim that back to 15–20% max, today if you can, before this quarter closes." I told him I'd handle it. I never made the call. I let the quarter close with her fully exposed, and when he asked again in October, I told him I'd already adjusted her position. Which wasn't true, and he had no reason at the time to check a single client file behind my assurance. Meridian Growth Fund lost 31% of its value in the 14 months that followed, driven by 2 concentrated positions that went bad within months of each other, a fact that made the news in a small trade publication I know my mother never read. By the time she asked me, on a phone call in October, why her statement looked different than she expected, the account had dropped from $85,000 to just under $59,000. A loss of roughly $26,000 that she had no financial cushion to absorb. She asked me, her voice careful in the way it gets when she's trying not to sound accusatory, whether this was the kind of thing that corrects itself. I told her markets fluctuate and that pulling out now would lock in a loss that time could still recover. That was true in the abstract and false in the specific. Because Meridian never did recover, the fund was quietly wound down 18 months later, and her final distribution after fees came to $39,400, less than half of what she'd started with. I want to be specific about the exact date the fund's decline became undeniable, because vague timelines are how I let myself avoid full accountability for years. The statement that finally prompted her October phone call was dated October 11th, and it showed the account at $58,900, down from the $85,000 she'd started with 14 months earlier. I remember exactly where I was when she called, at my desk at Halbrook Marsh. Between two other client calls, a Tuesday, and I remember minimizing the browser tab showing her account before I even answered, an instinct I didn't examine at the time and can't excuse now. She asked her question carefully, the way she asks most hard questions, giving me every opportunity to be honest with her. I gave her, instead, the calm, practiced reassurance I'd give any client experiencing a rough quarter, delivered in the same measured tone, using the same pauses, as if the fact that she was my mother rather than a stranger on my client roster changed nothing about the script I reached for. Here is the part of this story I've spent longer avoiding than any other part. Instead of telling my mother, clearly and directly, that I had put her retirement savings into an inappropriate, oversized position against my own firm's internal guidance, I let the story become, in my own head and eventually out loud to other people, a story about her. I told my brother during one phone call that Mom had insisted on being more aggressive than I recommended, and that she never really understood the risk even when I explained it multiple times, a version of events that inverted the actual paperwork sitting in my own files. I told a boyfriend at the time that my mother was financially anxious in a way that made it hard to help her, language that made her sound like the unreasonable one. Over the following months, in small conversations with people who had no way of checking the facts, I built a version of my mother as someone difficult, someone who second-guessed my professional judgment out of an inability to trust me, and I did this specifically so that the distance I was about to put between us would look, to anyone watching, like a reasonable response to her behavior instead of what it actually was, a strategy for outrunning my own guilt. I want to describe that Christmas dinner in more detail than I usually let myself, because the specific words matter. She said, gently setting down her fork, "I just wonder sometimes if the fund thing might still turn around, if maybe I should have said something sooner about how much we put in." I heard, underneath a genuinely mild and searching question, an accusation I'd already leveled at myself 100 times in private, and rather than absorb it from her the way I'd been absorbing it alone for months, I said, sharper than I intended, "I'm not going to sit here and be blamed for market conditions I don't control. Especially at Christmas." The table went quiet. James later told me our mother didn't say another full sentence for the rest of the meal, just answered direct questions in as few words as possible. The specific, careful silence of someone who has just been told, without it being said outright, that her own losses are not a subject she's allowed to raise with her own daughter. The freeze-out itself started at Christmas, 7 months after the fund's final distribution. My mother asked, gently, at dinner, whether I thought the fund situation might ever recover enough to make a difference, and something in me, shame wearing the mask of irritation, though I couldn't have named it that way at the time, snapped. And I told her I didn't appreciate being blamed for market conditions I couldn't control, in a tone sharp enough that James later told me our mother didn't say another word for the rest of the meal. I left the next morning a day earlier than planned. I called twice over the following 2 months, brief, functional calls, and then I stopped calling altogether, and when she called me, I let it go to voicemail, and I told myself in the specific language I used in my own head at the time that I needed space from someone who made me feel like a failure for trying to help her. For 6 years, 4 months, that space became the entire shape of the relationship. I sent a card at Christmas some years and not others. I didn't call on her birthday twice. I moved to a new house in year 3, an actual house with a mortgage instead of the apartment I'd rented for a decade, and I didn't give her the new address for 8 months. Not out of any decision so much as a low-grade avoidance that never resolved itself into an actual choice. My career, in that same window, did nothing but grow. I made partner in year 4, took on 3 new high-net-worth families as personal clients, bought the house on Larimer Street with a mortgage I was proud of qualifying for on my own income, and told colleagues, when family came up at all, that I wasn't close with my mother, a phrase that made a 6-year silence sound like a lifestyle choice instead of an unresolved wound I'd never let myself look at directly. I told myself, across those 6 years, a coherent and almost professional-sounding story about why the silence made sense. One I could recite to a therapist I saw briefly in year 3 without ever once mentioning Meridian by name, that my mother and I had different values around money and independence, that some relationships simply run their course once children become adults, that I was protecting my peace. Every one of those phrases was borrowed language, the kind you absorb from self-help books and podcasts designed to make ordinary avoidance sound like emotional wisdom, and I used that language the exact same way I'd used appropriate for her risk tolerance and time horizon, as a script sturdy enough to stand in for a truth I wasn't ready to say plainly. Even to myself, even alone, even at 3 in the morning, when the actual shape of what I'd done occasionally surfaced before I pushed it back under. In year 2 of the silence, I spent Thanksgiving with a boyfriend's family in Aspen instead of flying home, the first Thanksgiving of my adult life I hadn't spent in Tulsa in some form, and I remember feeling, that day, a kind of relief that unsettled me even as I felt it, relief at not having to sit across from her and manage the tension neither of us was naming directly. James called that evening, not to guilt me, just to update me the way he did most years, and mentioned that our mother had made a full dinner anyway, for just the 2 of them and a neighbor whose family lived out of state, and that she'd set a 3rd place at the table out of what James called old habit before quietly clearing it before anyone sat down. He hadn't meant to tell me something that would sit with me for years. He told me almost as an aside, and it became one of the details I couldn't stop returning to once the folder made everything else visible. Making partner at Halbrook Marsh in year 4 was the single proudest professional moment of my life up to that point, and I remember standing at the small celebration the firm threw, champagne in hand, and thinking, with something like satisfaction, that I'd built all of this entirely on my own, through discipline and skill and hours no one had handed me. It did not occur to me, standing in that room, to wonder what portion of my own financial stability, the mortgage I'd qualified for confidently, the savings cushion that let me take professional risks other associates couldn't afford to take, might have been quietly underwritten by someone I'd stopped speaking to. Because at that point I still had no idea it was happening. I only understand the irony of that champagne toast now, in hindsight, as something closer to a joke at my own expense than a milestone I'm still fully proud of. By year 4, the silence had settled into something almost administrative, a routine neither of us discussed but both of us maintained. I sent a birthday check instead of a call, $100. An amount I chose because it felt substantial enough to seem like care, without requiring the vulnerability an actual conversation would have demanded. She cashed every check. She never once texted to say thank you or to ask when she'd hear my voice again, and for a long time I read that silence as confirmation that she was fine without me, when I understand now it more likely meant she'd simply stopped expecting more than the check. In year 6, 4 months before the stroke, James mentioned, during one of our occasional calls, that our mother had picked up extra per diem shifts at the hospice house downtown, on top of her regular schedule, working nights most people her age had long since stopped working. I asked him, mildly curious, whether she needed the money. He said, "I don't think so. She's never asked me for anything. Maybe she just likes staying busy." I accepted that explanation without examining it further, because examining it would have meant asking a question I wasn't ready to hear the answer to. There were cracks in that silence I didn't let myself examine at the time. James called me in year 3 to say our mother had had a minor fall in the driveway, nothing serious, a sprained wrist, but he'd mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd asked the ER nurse not to call me because she didn't want to bother me at work. I told myself that was considerate rather than what it actually was, which was a woman who had learned, through 6 years of unreturned calls, not to expect me to come. In year 5, I heard secondhand through a cousin's Facebook post that my mother had been honored at a hospice care conference for 30 years of service, a milestone I found out about 3 weeks after the fact from a stranger's comment thread, instead of from her, because she'd stopped assuming I wanted to know things like that. Once, in year 5, driving home from a client dinner, I sat in my car outside my own house for almost 20 minutes with her contact open on my phone, thumb over the call button, and then I put the phone down and went inside and didn't call, and I remember thinking, distinctly, that 20 minutes was a long time to spend almost doing something and then not doing it. The discovery came last Tuesday, and it didn't come from her. And it didn't come the way I would have imagined it if I'd ever let myself imagine it. My mortgage servicer called me about an unrelated administrative matter, confirming my email on file after a system migration, and the representative, a young man reading from a script, mentioned in passing that my account showed a recurring supplemental principal payment that had failed to process that month for the first time in years, and asked if I wanted to update the payment method on file. I told him I didn't have any recurring payment set up beyond my standard monthly mortgage draft. He put me on hold, came back, and told me the supplemental payment, $410 a month, had been coming from an external account for 6 years and 2 months, going back almost to the exact month I'd moved into the Larimer Street house. The house whose address I hadn't given my mother for 8 months. I asked, my voice not quite steady, whose account that was. He told me, apologetically, that he wasn't authorized to disclose the account holder's name without a supervisor's approval, but that the payment history showed the same account number every single month without a single missed payment, until now. I want to go back to the mortgage servicer call itself, because I've replayed it enough times now that I remember details I almost missed the first time through. The representative, whose name I never got, mentioned that the supplemental payment amount had actually increased twice over the 6 years, from an initial $325 to the $410 it had settled at more recently, adjustments that lined up, I later confirmed against her pay stubs in the folder. Almost exactly with cost of living increases in her hospice per diem rate. She hadn't just set up an automatic transfer and forgotten about it. She had been actively managing it, recalibrating it against her own income for 6 straight years, the same careful attentiveness she'd once brought to a jar of grocery money on top of a refrigerator. Scaled up to a size that could actually protect a house. The flight from Denver to Tulsa is short, under 2 hours, and I don't remember most of it. I remember calling my assistant from the gate to clear my calendar for the week without explaining why, and I remember staring at the seat back in front of me somewhere over the Kansas border, running the 6 years backward in my head, trying to locate a single moment where I might have noticed something and simply hadn't been looking. I couldn't find one. That absence of a moment, the fact that she'd hidden it that completely, that carefully, for that long, was its own kind of evidence of how much effort it had taken her to make sure I never had to feel the weight of it. The same way I'd never had to feel the weight of the emergency fund as a kid. I called James before I called anyone else. Some instinct telling me this connected to something I didn't want to be true yet. He didn't answer. He called back 9 minutes later, and before I could say anything about the mortgage, he said, "Claire, Mom had a stroke this morning. She's at St. Francis. You need to come." I understood, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, that these were the same 3 days, the missed payment and the stroke, and some part of me knew before anyone told me directly that they weren't a coincidence. I flew to Tulsa that afternoon. James met me at the hospital, and somewhere in the blur of the first hour, doctors, a diagnosis of a moderate ischemic stroke, speech affected but stable, prognosis cautiously good. He handed me something he'd found in her kitchen while grabbing a change of clothes for her. A small accordion folder, the kind you'd keep tax documents in. Labeled in her handwriting, Claire, House. Inside was 6 years of bank statements from an account I didn't know existed. A modest savings account she'd opened the same month I moved into Larimer Street. Funded, according to the earliest deposit slip, entirely by picking up hospice shift differentials she hadn't taken in years. 4 to midnight coverage other nurses avoided. Converted directly into a $410 transfer to my mortgage servicer every single month without fail, time-stamped 2 days before my due date, every month for 74 months in a row. Behind the bank statements was a single sheet of notebook paper, torn from the same spiral notebook she'd kept by her bed my whole childhood, dated the month I'd stopped calling, that read only, "Found her new address through James's Christmas card. Started the transfer the same week. She doesn't need to know. She's carrying enough already, whatever it is she thinks she's carrying. This is mine to do quietly." James told me, standing in that hospital hallway, that when he'd asked our mother once, years ago, if she ever thought about giving up on me, she'd told him, "I'm still on her emergency contact list at the bank, James. Some people take themselves off." I never did. I want to describe the hospital itself for a moment, because the detail matters more than it might seem to. St. Francis is the same hospital my mother worked hospice shifts in for 31 years, and the ICU nurse who checked her vitals that first night, a woman named Denise who'd worked alongside my mother for over a decade, recognized my last name on the visitor log and pulled me aside in the hallway. "Your mom talks about you all the time on shift," Denise told me, matter-of-factly, no idea of the 6 years behind that sentence. "Says her daughter's some big financial advisor out in Denver. Real proud of you." I didn't correct her. I didn't know how to explain, standing in a hospital corridor at 11 at night, that the pride Denise was describing had apparently survived 6 years of me giving her almost nothing to be proud of. I sat in a hard plastic chair outside the ICU that night with that folder in my lap and read every statement twice, and I want to describe what that felt like honestly, instead of dressing it into something more dramatic than it was. It wasn't only grief, and it wasn't only shame either. It was a specific kind of vertigo, the sensation of an entire timeline rearranging itself. Because I had spent 6 years telling a story in which my mother was the one who'd made things difficult, the one whose financial anxiety had strained our relationship, and the actual paper trail in my lap showed a woman working overnight shifts in her 60s to protect a house she'd never been invited into. What followed in the days after was a slow unraveling of every piece of that childhood I'd stopped letting myself remember clearly. I thought about the $11 jar on top of the refrigerator and understood, for the first time as an adult instead of a child, exactly what it had cost her to make sure James and I never felt the weight of her sacrifices. And I understood that the mortgage payments were the same habit wearing an adult's face, protection offered without ever asking to be thanked for it. Protection offered specifically so I would never have to feel the debt of it. I thought about the framed text message on her nightstand, kept for 11 years, and understood that she had been proud of me the entire time. I decided she was the obstacle to my success, rather than, in fact, one of its quiet architects. There's a detail from that first night in the hospital I haven't mentioned yet, and it belongs here more than anywhere else. While James went to find coffee, I sat alone with the accordion folder and noticed, tucked behind the last bank statement, a single deposit slip from just 11 days before her stroke for an extra per diem shift, with a small note in the memo line that wasn't addressed to a bank at all. August. Claire's payment covered through September. Plus a little extra in case anything comes up with the roof she mentioned to James. I hadn't mentioned any roof problem to James. He had mentioned it to her, in passing, months earlier, about a small leak I'd been putting off dealing with, a conversation I wasn't even part of, and she had quietly begun setting aside money for a repair I hadn't asked anyone for help with, and didn't know she knew about. That single line undid me more than the 6 years of statements combined, because it meant the protection hadn't stopped at the boundary of what I'd explicitly hidden from her. It had grown, on its own, to cover things I hadn't even thought to hide, because I hadn't imagined she was still paying attention closely enough to need to. I thought, too, about the coat she must have worn inside during whatever version of a cold February this last stretch had been for her. The specific kind of discomfort she absorbed without narrating it to anyone, the same discomfort I'd apparently inherited as a habit and then turned inward, toward her, instead of toward myself, over 6 years of silence. I thought about Frank from her church, the man who'd asked her out more than once over the years and been gently declined, and wondered, uselessly, whether some of those declines had come in years when she was working extra shifts to cover my mortgage and simply didn't have room, emotionally or logistically, to build anything new alongside the quiet maintenance of something old. I never asked her that directly. Some questions, I've learned, don't need answers so much as they need to be sat with as evidence of how much I still don't know about the actual cost of what she did for me. I called James the morning after I'd read through the folder, before visiting hours, and told him everything I'd finally understood about the fund and the 6 years of blame I'd quietly built to cover it. I braced for him to say he'd suspected as much all along. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "I knew something didn't add up about the story you told me back then, Claire. I just didn't push." Because pushing meant admitting I'd let you get away with it too, by not asking harder questions when Mom needed someone to. Neither of us apologized to the other in that call. We didn't need to. We'd both failed her in different rooms of the same house, and saying so out loud was its own kind of accounting. The confrontation I owed her came 4 days later, once her speech had returned enough for short sentences, in a hospital room with monitors beeping steadily behind her. I told her everything, without qualifiers this time, that I had put her retirement savings into a fund my own firm's internal guidance said was too large a position for her. That I had lied about her risk tolerance on the paperwork. That I had spent years afterward telling other people a version of the story that made her the difficult one instead of me. And that I had frozen her out for 6 years to avoid facing what I'd actually done. She listened, her left hand still weaker than her right, resting on the blanket. When I finished, she said, slowly, working around the effort of forming the words, "I know what happened to the money, Claire. I read the statements. I've always known." I asked her, my voice breaking on it, why she never said anything, why she let me believe, for years, that she simply didn't understand the risk. She said, "Because you needed to be the one who figured it out. I couldn't make you understand something you weren't ready to know yet. I could only wait." It was the shortest sentence anyone has ever used to take me completely apart. I told Roger Kessler what had actually happened, too, Once I was back in Denver, sitting in his office with the door closed for the first time in years about something that wasn't a client win. I told him I'd misrepresented my mother's risk tolerance on the intake paperwork and ignored his direct instruction to reduce her position. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked whether she intended to file a complaint. I told him no. That wasn't why I was telling him. He said, "Then why are you telling me, Claire?" I said because I needed at least one person at that firm to know the actual story instead of the version I'd let everyone believe, even if nothing came of it professionally. Something did come of it. Eventually, a formal note in my file, a mandated compliance review of my last 3 years of client paperwork, no public consequence, nothing a client would ever see. But the quiet correction mattered to me more than the paperwork did, because it meant the version of events I'd built to protect myself no longer existed anywhere, including in my own firm's records. I will not tell you this ends with a clean, finished reconciliation, because it doesn't, not yet, and pretending otherwise would dishonor what it's actually costing both of us to rebuild anything at all. I offered the same week to pay her back the full $26,000 she lost in Meridian, immediately, in a lump sum from my own savings. She said no. She said money changing hands again wouldn't undo 6 years, and that she didn't want a gesture that size from me if it meant I'd consider the debt settled and the relationship finished in the same transaction. What she asked for instead was smaller and harder, that I come back to Tulsa 1 weekend a month, no exceptions, starting as soon as she's discharged. For as long as it takes her to trust that I'll keep showing up without a hospital forcing the issue. I've kept that so far. It isn't much of a record yet. It's 1 weekend, and a phone call every Sunday since, which I answer now on the first ring instead of the third. Before I left Tulsa that first week, James and I sat down together at her kitchen table, without her, and went through the accordion folder one more time. Not for evidence this time, but almost as a kind of joint reckoning, the two of us finally looking directly at something we'd both, in our different ways, avoided looking at closely enough for years. He told me he wanted to split whatever ongoing support she might need going forward, that it shouldn't fall entirely to either of us the way the last 6 years had let it fall entirely to her, quietly, without either of us noticing. We agreed, that afternoon, to set up a joint account between the two of us, funded automatically each month, earmarked for whatever she needs and never mentioned to her unless she asks, a mirror. Intentionally, of the things she'd built for me without asking either of us for anything in return. The day she was discharged, 3 weeks later, I drove her home to Independence Street myself instead of letting James do it, and I stayed the full first week, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, driving her to outpatient physical therapy twice that week while her left hand slowly relearned how to hold a coffee cup. She didn't make a production of any of it, didn't thank me repeatedly, or make me feel forgiven ahead of schedule. On the third day, folding laundry together at the small table where the pot roast had once sat between us and a fund prospectus, she said, without looking up, "I'm glad you're here, Claire. I'm not going to pretend the last 6 years didn't happen, just because you are, though." I told her I wasn't asking her to pretend anything. It was the most honest exchange we'd had in longer than either of us could probably calculate exactly. I did pay back the $26,000 anyway, quietly, not to her directly but into the account she'd been using to fund my mortgage payments, so that whatever she chooses to do with it next is entirely hers to decide. No strings, no accompanying speech from me about how it makes me feel. I bought her a new spiral notebook, the same brand, to replace the one with a page torn out of it. And I didn't say anything about why when I gave it to her, and she didn't ask. I started keeping one of my own now, 1 line a day, some good thing, even on the days when the good thing is small, because I finally understand what she was actually protecting all those years by writing hers. Not optimism, exactly, just proof, gathered one ordinary day at a time. That a life could still be worth showing up for even when it didn't feel that way yet. The $11 jar doesn't exist anymore, in any literal sense. There's no jar on my refrigerator, no grocery money set aside for a child's unplanned needs, but I've started, instead, keeping a small fund at my own firm, unrelated to any client account. For exactly one purpose, covering document fees or minor account corrections for elderly clients who can't easily absorb an unexpected cost, quietly, without it ever appearing on a statement they'd have to ask questions about. Roger Kessler doesn't know why I started it. I haven't told him. Some things you do because someone once did them for you long before you understood what they cost. Some weekends in Tulsa now go better than others, and I want to be honest about that instead of rounding it up into something tidier than it is. There was a Sunday in the second month where she canceled our call at the last minute, no explanation, and I spent that whole evening turning it over, wondering if it meant something had slipped backward between us. Before she called the next morning to say simply that she'd had a hard day and hadn't wanted to bring it into the one thing we'd only just started rebuilding. I understood, hearing that she was being more careful with the new version of us than I'd been with the old one, protecting it the way she'd once protected a jar of grocery money. And that the least I owed her was matching that same care, instead of needing constant reassurance that the repair was holding. I think about Denise, the nurse in the IQ hallway, more than I expected to when this all started, because she gave me, without knowing it, the clearest measure of what I'd actually lost during those 6 years, not my mother's money, which I could calculate to the dollar once I finally looked, but 6 years of a woman being quietly proud of me to near strangers on night shifts, while I told a different set of near strangers a story where she was the difficult one. I can't get those 6 years of ordinary pride back any more than I can get back the calls I let go to voicemail. I can only be, from here forward, someone worth the pride she apparently never stopped extending, whether or not I'd earned it yet. What I understand now that I didn't understand at that kitchen table in Tulsa with a fund prospectus between us is that protecting someone and controlling someone can look identical from a distance, and that it took me losing 6 years to learn the difference from close enough to feel it. My mother knew what I'd done to her money almost from the beginning, and instead of using that knowledge to punish me the way I'd have deserved, she spent 6 years quietly, making sure the consequences of my worst professional decision never landed on the one place I couldn't afford to lose. I don't think I've earned that yet. I don't think 6 weekends make up for 6 years. I only know I intend to keep showing up until it does, or until she tells me it's enough, whichever comes first, and either answer will be more than I gave her before. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.